Life is complicated. There's a lot you need to know to get it right. And with endless demands on our time, how can one person possibly do it all? Well, the good news is you don't have to go it alone, and you don't have to know everything. You just have to find yourself some really wise friends. Every summer, my husband and I try to plan something special to do together when our two daughters go away to fine arts camp. This summer, we decided to clean out the basement. You can't believe how much flotsam and jetsam you can accumulate over a 15-year marriage. And every single box is a trip down memory lane. Like this one, for example. It's filled with writing samples and artwork and cards and pictures from my two daughters' elementary school years. There's tons of stuff in here, and most of it should probably just be purged. I hate to admit it, but my little kids aren't little anymore. As a parent, I worry. Am I doing a good job? Am I asking the right questions? Am I giving them the right answers? Am I preparing my children to be independent thinkers? I hope so. But Walt Williams wanted to do more than just hope. When his oldest was 6 years old and asking him the kind of big girl questions he found it hard to give her satisfactory answers to, he decided to write a book to her future self, a book that she could read when she was older. He spent 10 years doing it. And the result was a mythological tale that dealt with some of the great questions we all ponder. The Garden at the Roof of the World. Walt Williams, thank you so much for coming on Wise Friends today.
Veronica, thank you so much for having me.
Walt, I think the first and major question I have for you is, what compelled you to write the book, The Garden at the Roof of the World?
When my eldest daughter was young, she got tired of me reading to her stories out of books. She started demanding from me, tell me a story that you made up. And after a while, I started telling her a story about a young girl who's asked by a unicorn to go and save their king who's dying. And as I kept on telling her more episodes in the story, I started to realize that the story had legs, that more people would be interested in it than my daughter. But I'm an anthropologist, I'm an historian, I'm a mythologist. And so while I'm telling this to Kayla, the wheels in the back of my mind are spinning that there's no way that I could write a story about a unicorn without dealing with the ancient myths about a unicorn, which all have to do with human sexuality and human purity. And I'm desperately trying to keep this out of the story as I'm telling her it.
Because at this point, how old is she?
She's 6 at this point,
okay,
so
gotcha.
She doesn't need to know any of that.
All right.
What she does need to know is that unicorns are special and magical, and you have to behave yourself when you're around them, but she has no idea what behaving yourself intends.
Right.
So I start writing the story, but I decide I'm going to write this for adults. And more specifically, I want to make certain that I preserve the idea that women would be the main characters of the story, and write it so that it becomes a story that they'll grow towards. A story that as they become women themselves will challenge them to think about more than just their sexuality. As I write the story, I take the characters across all of Europe 800 years ago, which was a very, very different place in attitude, in culture, in all sorts of things, including political economic systems, the social status of people. And I stopped to do research to try to make it as historically accurate as possible while still keeping it a fantasy.
Sure.
After all, to the people of 800 years ago, they would have been less surprised to find a unicorn in the woods than they would have been to find that the world was round.
Exactly.
They were very used to living in a mythological space, so I wanted that to come alive within the story,
Sure.
while giving full breath to the diversity of what somebody 800 years ago would have encountered.
Right. Let's go back before we get more deeply into the story, because I'd love to be able to get a synopsis of it from you. Let's go back to that interaction that you have with your daughter.
Yes.
And that moment where it starts to occur to you that the subjects that you're dealing with, you are dealing with now for that 6-year-old version of your daughter. But while you're telling her this story, you're imagining the 36-year-old version of your daughter and what she needs to know from her father. And so it's wisdom that you have now that you can't give her. Was that what propelled you into the writing of?
Partly, especially since Kayla was always a skeptic, always somebody asking questions, challenging, never taking things at face value.
Right.
I didn't want that to ever stop in her life. But there are some things you cannot talk to a 6-year-old about simply because they don't have the context in their own lives to understand it.
Of course.
And so I'm hearing these questions from her, and I'm trying to, in the story, write down answers that will stand with her her entire life. And the trouble is that when you make choices in writing a story, to place a story in a particular place of time, you have to be careful about modern attitudes intruding into a story of the past. And that was always a tension in the writing of it. And so I pulled back just a little bit from addressing issues that she would be facing in her life, because that started to feel preachy to me and started to feel like, oh God, I'm writing a story that's going to beat people over the head with a message.
Right.
I didn't want that.
Right.
So instead of dealing with concrete issues that she's going to have to face in her life, I started making it more abstract issues that all of us have to face as we live our lives.
Exactly.
And
so there were universal themes that you wanted to
Yes.
get to. Yeah.
Yes. And there were themes of faith. Kayla lives in a family where her father's one religion, her mother's another religion. And so the story is very much a journey of, is there a right way to God? Is there a right way to live one's life? Is there a single path that will get you there that's better than other paths? Or perhaps it's more complicated than that. Perhaps the world is more rich than that. And one of the things that I delighted in doing was bringing together people of multiple faiths through multiple mythologies of the unicorn. In Christianity, they tell stories of unicorns, but there's a story of the unicorn within Judaic scripture and Judaic mythology. There's a story of a unicorn within Islamic mythology. Going back to Judaism for a moment, the unicorn is thought to be in some readings of the Torah one of the animals of the Ark of the Covenant.
Wow.
One of the animals in the Tanakh.
So the unicorn itself is a universal theme
Yes,
of sorts.
Very much so.
Give us a quick synopsis. It is fascinating. Give us a quick synopsis of the story and this character of the unicorn and its importance in the story, just if you can.
What would you do to save something innocent? Something that knew us before we turned away from God. That's part of the dilemma that my main character, Gwenilla, faces. She's been asked to do something, to journey back to Eden, to try to pluck a piece of fruit from the tree of life. Not the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, but the tree that was taken from us because we chose to pick fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And return with that fruit, despite all the temptations to eat of it herself, to feed it to that unicorn who walked with Adam and Eve before the fall. Trying to survive that journey, trying to find that garden is both a physical journey and a metaphysical journey. She searches all through Europe, all through the Near East. Is this in Jerusalem? is this in what's widely regarded at the time as the center of the world? Or is it perhaps someplace different? And she discovers as she journeys that this is not a simple thing to find, and that the journey depends upon her being true to herself and needing to discover what that's all about, and needing to understand what it is to love, and that love is infinitely more than desire.
What is at stake if she doesn't find the garden?
Simply the death of this unicorn. And to us in our modern era, we look at that and say, so somebody dies. One of the reasons I said this 800 years ago is faith had a very different meaning in life back then. The loss of a creature that knew humanity before the fall would have been unmeasurable, in terms of a tragedy. This is the time and space where they were writing quests to the Holy Grail, and really believing that there was a Holy Grail to find. This was the time and place where they looked at the Torah as the tree of life. And that in understanding that became a mystical path back to God.
Is this unicorn the last of its kind?
No, it's the first. It is the ancestor of them all. It walked with Eve, it walked with Adam, and it's old, it's unmeasurably old, and it is tired and dying. But it is the only thing that remembers us when we're innocent. Would you do something to save the life of that? Is that something special and unique within the world? And to the characters in the story, they choose yes. They will incur unmeasurable risks in order to keep that hope within the world, that there's something that remembers us from before we turned away from God, something that we can look to as a way to go back towards God, a way to remind us of what was lost.
Now, your heroine, right?
Vanilla.
How was she chosen? And was this a way to your daughters? Was this a signal to your daughters of some kind?
Yes, it was. Gwinella's rushing home. Her brother is dying. She's going to be asked by her parents to marry a village local so that he can take care of them in their old age. Very typical pattern of behavior at the time.
Because they were losing their heir.
Exactly.
Okay. And
so her husband needs to become the heir. They had sent her away to school so that she could marry better, and she's being pulled away from that. And unfortunately for her, she's fallen in love with a student, a young poet, and had desperately been hoping to marry for love. And back 800 years ago, the idea of marrying for love was such a new idea. It was revolutionary. People didn't do that. And so she's heartbroken, but she goes willingly. She's a good girl. On her way home, she sees an old woman who gets hurt. She stops what she's doing to run over to that old woman and to clean her up and help her out. That old woman turns out to be Lilith out of Judaic mythology. I have her ask Gwynella to go and find a unicorn, to help herself in healing her brother. Because in medieval mythology, unicorns can heal the unhealable. But also to set her on this journey. The unicorn was the only thing that accompanied Lilith into her exile. The only thing that would stand by her in her refusal to put up with what she thought was Adam's mistreatment. And so I'm immediately tapping into a mythological story while also sending her on a mythological journey. And it comes from an act of charity to a complete stranger.
But you're drawing from what we know to be sacred texts from, in this case, Judaism.
And Christianity.
So you're also hoping that people are ignited by the knowledge of that these are those stories. These are in those texts. And if you haven't discovered them, or if you never were exposed to those, that might take you in that direction.
Very much so. And so I actively start seeking out mythologies to start weaving into this. I mentioned that the unicorn is a common mythological element in Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, but also within Hinduism and Buddhism.
Wow.
And it's something that most people aren't aware of. And so I weave together the myths of these 5 different religious traditions. As they journey throughout the physical world, they encounter this mythological framework of these 5 different religions. And members of those religions join with Gwynella in her search for the garden at the roof of the world.
Amazing.
So we have now some Christian ladies, a young Jewish man who's not only interested in helping them, but interested in one of the ladies, a Christian knight, a Muslim knight, a Hindu ascetic, and a Buddhist monk, traveling, trying to return to where Eden was hidden at the dawn of time in order to save the life of that unicorn.
Cool. Was your daughter, did you have the sense when she was that age, dissatisfied with the religious stories that she was being told?
Very much so. She was also very torn between the identity of wanting to be Jewish and wanting to be Christian, and not knowing how to walk those 2 paths and be one person.
Yeah.
So by telling a story that's about people of different traditions walking the same path, I was trying to show her that the things that divide us are less important than the things we have in common.
Yeah.
And it's a simple part of the story, but it was the motivation behind writing it when I did and how I did. There's a lot more to it than just that very, very simple narrative.
Right.
Of course, I'm very respectful of the differences within the mythologies and the challenges that somebody would have to face in trying to be a good person, maintain being a good person, and traveling across a really lousy period of time.
Right. When you write, you're obviously not a woman, okay?
Yes.
You're a man, yet you're writing mostly from the perspective of your heroine.
Yes.
In what person is the book written, Walt?
The book is written actually as a letter by the Buddhist monk to a friend of his. And so he tells the story of the 5 women. I tried initially trying to write it from the voice of the 5 women, and I could never quite get close enough to them. I spent a lot of time working with some friends of mine who are also authors, who are women, trying to bridge that distance, get that close. And I decided on taking a step back and letting there be a narrator to the story. And that allowed me to do 2 other things. And one of which is introduce the story as something that's going to bridge cultures. So he's a monk living in Nepal, writing to a priest living in Paris. The other thing that it allowed me to do was introduce the idea that in this story there's going to be loss and sorrow. It's not a happy story. People die. Lives get ruined. And I didn't want, so often people think that fantasy, oh, it's going to be fancy fluff, destroy the cupcake of doom and save the world. That's not what the story is. That there are some real stakes involved here. And in his introduction to the book, he indicates that at least for him, it ends in sorrow. And so I've set the tables that this is going to be a multicultural book, a multi-religious book, a journey involving sorrow as well as heroism. And hopefully they're still curious enough to read on.
So you've made the point initially that you started the idea for the book when your children were young, little. But you're writing it for an adult audience.
Yes, I am.
How old are your daughters now?
Taylor is now 16, going to be 17 this December. My younger daughter is 13, going to be 14 in just a few months. And
neither one of them are yet ready, in your view, for this particular content.
I am terrified of them reading one particular chapter. But I wouldn't pull that chapter out of the book for the life of me.
Yeah.
And I'm going to be handing them copies of the book and encouraging them to read the full contents. But there's one chapter that I don't know anybody who's really ready for that chapter. It's very surreal. It's a dreamlike sequence in which one of the characters has become possessed by her own desires. And in order to continue with the others, she needs to rid herself of that demon. And so she goes into the desert. That's so often people went into the desert to purge themselves.
Yes.
And she has to basically fight with herself for, does she want to live a life where she's constantly giving into the easy way of living out these desires? Or does she want to perhaps live a life where she's choosing love instead of desire? She comes out of the court of love in France, where she's grown up understanding that love and desire are the same thing, and that to love somebody is to desire them. And what she's encountering is that love isn't desire, love is giving.
Right.
It's not taking from somebody else, it's giving of yourself. And that's the tension that she's been wrestling with the entire time. And it comes to a head in a chapter that is very surreal, very dreamlike, and is her metaphorically wrestling with that very issue. And she comes out of it. She comes through that. And that's something that, while I'm terrified of them reading, I want them to see that this is something that we all struggle with, especially since they're adolescents.
Right. I was just going to say, certainly they'll understand to the extent that they can in the context that they have now, the understanding that they have now, and certainly, years from now, when they reread that, they'll bring a new understanding to it based on their experiences.
Yeah.
Right. When I think of parenting, and I have 5 children, I have 3 stepchildren and 2. My husband and I have 2 together. I'm always struggling, and I talked about this with you earlier, with how much I can do as a parent to impact my children's thinking.
Yeah.
And I'm so moved by your taking on such a mammoth project like this from the perspective of getting at that with your children. It came from that place, and certainly it grew for you as a writer and in other ways, obviously. So you had other motives as the project went on. But I understand that so viscerally myself, this idea that maybe there's something that I can do. In fact, many people don't realize that the reason that I have a show on cable, and this is one of 2 shows I've done in the past, the reason I started out doing it was because I wanted to affect the way my children thought about the world.
And all you can do with that, especially after they grow a little bit, is challenge them to reconsider things. They're going to choose different paths than you chose.
Yeah.
What you want them to do is to choose those paths critically, with a lot of thought, if they're religious at all or spiritual at all, with a bit of prayer. But more importantly, that they just don't rush blindly into things because it's the fashionable thing to do, or because that's what all their friends are doing, or because they're terrified of doing otherwise.
Right. And that there are deep mysteries in our world, and sometimes people who feel or say that they have an answer can for themselves have that answer, but that wouldn't be the answer
for anyone else.
And that's a very tough thing for anybody, not just a child,
Yeah.
to understand.
That's very true. And the worst thing is that each of us are deep mysteries. I've been married now 23 years, going on 24.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And I'm still discovering who my wife is.
Yeah.
She is such a mystery to me, though I know her so well, and we've known each other almost 30 years.
Yeah.
I'm much the same for her. We're constantly discovering each other. And that trying to share with others the idea that we are each mysteries.
Right.
And each time we think we have those answers, the rug gets pulled out from underneath us.
Yeah.
And it's not the answers that are important to begin with. It's the journey.
Right.
And that's why I made my story a journey. It almost doesn't matter how she gets there.
Right.
It's that she's trying to.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter that she fails along the way and gets tripped up, or her companions fail along the way and some of them die. It's that they are making the attempt. And that's all any of us do. And one of the fun things for me, and here I'm playing a little bit with mythology again, is that I'm fully aware that the tree of life is the Torah. And so in telling the story, I'm telling people, in your journey, follow what calls you. Keep following no matter what. Don't be afraid of failure. Don't be afraid of your own mistakes. Don't be afraid of others. Don't be afraid of yourself. And beyond all, don't be afraid of dying. Because none of that's important.
You know, we're taping this conversation in the middle of August, and the Jewish holidays are early this year.
Yes.
As my mother-in-law would say, they never come on time. But I think it's very apropos to this conversation as we go toward the Jewish New Year, to think about ways of, you know, providing some kind of thoughtful forgiveness of your past and a kind of open, excited feeling about your future. I think maybe when you reach our age, you start to think that you are comfortable in your place, in your emotional space, and to move out of it is scary. But a book like this one, it feels to me, opens up conversations and allows you to be a little bit more adventurous in your thinking and maybe in your life.
It certainly was in mine when writing it.
I bet.
And in encountering an interesting heresy, a Christian heresy that I wrote into the story because it just fit within the story. And being willing to step outside of formal religious beliefs and embrace mythology wherever it took me. That was scary because, well, you know, maybe there's some truth to this. Maybe I need to stop looking at these things as this is right, this is correct, this is wrong, but rather all of this is true. And embrace the message of the story. And so it pulled me out of my comfort zone into a space where, and this is where I've always delighted in my wife's tradition in Judaism, the idea that mutually contradictory things can be true.
Yes.
And Judaism is always truest to itself when it upholds that, and it constantly trips over itself and fails to do so, but that's okay.
Right.
So I let the contradictions within my own story stand as challenges and paradoxes for the readers of it to move beyond their comfort zone and to think that perhaps, as Kavundi is a Hindu mystic within the story, she's fully dedicated herself to following a life of God. And she discovers, much to her horror and dismay, that a common prostitute that she encounters has lived a truer path to God than she has in all of her effort. And it really pulls her out of herself. It shatters who she is. And it's only the beginning of the shattering of who she is, as she has to learn to embrace change. As I have her encounter Kali, which is all about that change. And God doesn't want us to come as fixed entities. But when we are called by God, we must let ourselves be changed. And that's never the way we want. That's never the way we want to control. That's scary.
Yeah.
And so in that part of the story, I let my readers know that to walk this path to the garden is fraught with danger.
Yeah.
You may lose yourself.
Right. Well, I feel like I've lost myself a little bit in our conversation today, Walt. I want to remind people watching that your book, The Garden at the Roof of the World, is now available.
Actually, August 30th. It will be available August 30th.
And we would like to put up website information for you on the screen so people will be able to contact you, and if they're interested in learning more.
I'd be thrilled to share that with you.
That'd be wonderful. Walt Williams, thank you so much for joining me today on Wise Friends.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.